So the college football playoff is expanding to 12 teams this coming season, which is, I think, objectively a good thing. I know that there are arguments to be made about whether or not it devalues the regular season. I don't agree with those statements. I think it heightens the regular season because instead of there being, 3 or 4 games with playoff implications, and you could argue every game has playoff implications. If you lose one game, yeah, I hear you. But for reality, there are like 3 or 4 games throughout the college football season in the 14 playoff era that had real legitimate playoff implications. That winner made the playoff, loser went home. Now, under a 12-team playoff, where potentially teams that are 9-3 are battling for playoff spots, it changes the game. It makes games that were rudimentary beforehand now really, really, really important. And so I appreciate that facet of the 12-team playoff. What I also appreciate is in the 4-team playoff, there were still very good teams that got left out because there's only room for 4 teams. I think Florida State before Jordan Travis's injury. I think Georgia this year. I think Ohio State this year. Ohio State gave Michigan their best game of the season. They lost. It was the closest game Michigan played all year. And they weren't anywhere close to sniffing the playoff. Missouri had a really good season. Wasn't anywhere close to sniffing the playoff. So I think the 12-team playoff, the expansion allowed, and I realize that this is somewhat anecdotal because a couple of years ago, and really for a pretty decent stretch there, it appeared as if there were only 2 or 1 teams who could win the national championship. And then this year you had 7 that could have easily won the national championship. So I think the expansion is a good thing. And I think there are some programs who think an expansion is a great thing because they now have a somewhat clear and defined path to the college football playoff, which, frankly, they weren't ever going to have before because they either didn't have the strong enough schedule, didn't have a strong enough brand. Now, I don't necessarily buy into the whole, this is ESPN run amok because they got the SEC. Like, okay, first of all, Alabama. Is Alabama a stronger brand than Florida State? Yes. But is Florida State a stronger brand than Washington? Yeah. So the idea that it was just the 4 biggest names who get in. Also, like, ESPN doesn't have the rights to Washington games going forward. And they do have the rights to Florida State. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. But nonetheless, I have a list of 5. I have a list of 5 slots here. I was going to say I have a list of 5 teams, but that's not true. I have a list of 5 slots of programs that will benefit from an expanded college football playoff. And at number 5, I have Penn State. Penn State was always, I guess not always, but frequently on the cusp of making the college football playoff. You go 10-2, and your 2 losses are to Michigan and Ohio State. Do you deserve to make the college football playoff? In a 12-team playoff, yeah, you do. And you're going to make that college football playoff probably 9 times out of 10 if that's your resume. 10-2, and your losses are to 2 powerhouse blue blood juggernaut programs. You're going to make the college football playoff. But at 10-2 right now, in the 4-team era, you don't got a shot. You don't have a prayer. The second you lose a second game, you had been disqualified. For some schools, the second you lost a first game, you were disqualified. Not going to happen in the college football playoff 12-team era. Penn State is a huge beneficiary of that. If you look back to James Franklin's tenure, how many times do they make the playoff? How many times do they make the playoff? If it was a 12-team playoff instead of a 4-team playoff. And hell, even the time that they won the Big Ten, they didn't make the playoff because Ohio State did. Now, Ohio State then laid an egg and got beat 31-0 and probably proved that Penn State should have made the playoff when Penn State won the Big Ten. But I mean, they went 11-3 in 2016 after losing in the Rose Bowl, 11-2 in 2017, 11-2 in 2019, 11-2 in 2022, 10-3 in 2023 after losing the Peach Bowl. This is a team that would have made the playoff 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times in the playoff era if it was a 12-team playoff instead of a 4-team playoff. What that does for your perception, what that does for the way fans view you, the way the college football world views you, your potential future at higher programs, should James Franklin ever want to climb that ladder to a bigger program. All of those things are altered by the amount of times you've made the college football playoff. And you can say, I've made the playoff 5 times instead of none. That's a big damn deal. It's a big, big deal. And he never had the case to make in a 14 playoff because outside of the year that they won the Big Ten championship and then lost in the Rose Bowl to a real hot USC team in one of those like fantastic Rose Bowls. What was it, like 52-49 or whatever? It was a classic. But they would have made the playoff 5 times if there was a 12-team playoff. I think that matters. So they benefit a ton. In my 4 slot, I got 2 Big Ten newcomers in Oregon and Washington. When you play in the Pac-12, there's a perception that in the past, maybe not this past season, but before that, certainly, that you were playing a frankly inferior schedule compared to the SEC, Big Ten, and even the Big 12. Oregon and Washington are not going to have that perception in the Big Ten, especially a Big Ten that now includes Oregon, Washington, USC, and UCLA. The Big Ten only got stronger. And we can pretend as if, and I'll die on this hill, we can pretend as if we really care about strength of schedule and strength of record and all of those things. We don't. Very rarely does anybody actually go through somebody's schedule and go, oh, wow, they played this team, this team, this team, this team. Holy cow. Because if you did, you would lose a lot of respect for a lot of the top programs because we hype games to make it look like a number 1 versus 14 matchup is like a big deal, knowing full well that number 1 is going to come out triumphantly. We hype those games up, but they're not really all that close, and it's not really all that impressive that you've got somebody in your division on your schedule. And so perception of the league matters more than perception of your schedule. If the SEC is viewed as very strong, if the Big Ten is viewed as elite, if the Big 12 is viewed as really difficult this year, that's what matters more than on an individual schedule-by-schedule basis. So Oregon and Washington now have the benefit of being in the Big Ten, where similarly to Penn State, if you can go 10-2 in the Big Ten, you're getting into the college football playoff. And if you're not, you're right there on the cusp. You're the team that got left out because of the group of 5 additive. So your pathway to a championship has gone from like this 2-lane back dirt road to like a 4-lane highway by a conference move and playoff expansion. And if the whole point of the playoff is to find who the best team in America is, having more chances is really going to benefit Oregon and Washington. Now, in my number 3 slot, I have similarly a same spot of Oklahoma State and Kansas State are both majorly helped because I don't think you're going to see an NCAA March Madness style conference breakdown where you're going to have like in March Madness now you'll get 8 teams from the ACC, 9 teams from the Big Ten, 7 from the SEC. I don't think you're going to see that. at least not at the start. I think you're going to see like the top 2 teams in the Big Ten, the top 2 teams in the Big 12, the top 3 teams in the SEC, the top 2 teams in the ACC. Like, I don't think it's going to be like completely dominated by one conference at the start. Now, you might get to later on down the line where somebody has established somewhat big dominance in the space, and we'll get the benefit of the doubt and get maybe 4 teams or 5 teams in the playoff rather than 2 or 3. But I think to start, you're going to see 2 teams from the ACC, 3 teams from the Big Ten, 3 teams from the SEC, 2 or 3 teams from the Big 12. I just don't see a scenario where in the first 2 or 3 years where it's, okay, there's 5 SEC teams, 3 Big Ten teams, 2 from the Big 12, 1 from the ACC. I just don't think you're going to see that right away. And so if you can finish second in the Big 12, which I think Oklahoma State and Kansas State in a newly revamped Big 12 are going to be in the conference championship game. Those 2 squads, I think, more often than not, are going to be in the Big 12 championship game. And then it will cycle through, your TCUs, BYUs, Houstons of the world that are going to be good, maybe not perennially, but can put together a run here or there. I think Oklahoma State and Kansas State both are primed to be in that second or top spot in the Big 12. And like I said, if you believe, like I do, that it's going to be somewhat diverse to start the college football season. For instance, like Oklahoma State would have made the playoff 3 or 4 times, depending on final rankings, under Mike Gundy at this point. Probably, you could argue, probably should have played for the national championship back in 2011. But in the college football playoff era, they finished with 10 wins 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times. And I think we have lost sight of how difficult it is to win 10 games because guys like Nick Saban, Urban Meyer did it damn near every year. Winning 10 games is difficult, and we'll talk about it more coming up. But if you can win 10 games in your conference, like Kansas State, and I think Oklahoma State are going to be right there on the edge, like Kansas State generally finishes like 8-4, 9-3. If they can put together that 10-2 run, whoever finishes in second place in the Big 12 is likely to have a really great shot to make the college football playoff in a 12-team era 10 times out of 10. Barring a wild, wacky year like we got this year. In my number 2 slot, I have the entire ACC because the conference kind of has this history of being dominated by one school where you just take their turns dominating, and not even maybe the conference, but like Miami, not in the ACC, but Miami has a strong football history. Virginia Tech has a strong football history. Florida State, Clemson. Now, none of them have really been able to put that together to be you could argue Florida State is a blue blood, but there have been some dips there that you could argue against it. But nobody's had that super long, sustained run in the ACC of being the top dog. And when you're not the top dog constantly, you don't get that benefit of the doubt that Alabama got this year to make the college football playoff, or Georgia got to be ranked number 1 all season, whatever the case may be. If you don't have that super long, sustained run of 10 straight years of just pure hot American excellence, you're not getting that benefit of the doubt, and that it's not necessarily fair. Like, Clemson put it together for a decade, and even this past season when they were losing games, it was like, is this the end of the Clemson dynasty? I don't know. I think the answer to that question is yes, by the way. One of the podcasts this season was like, okay, I'm off the Clemson bandwagon. That'll do. You're done. But I think when you don't have that long sustained history of success like Florida did for a while, like LSU has had, like Alabama has had, like Ohio State, Oklahoma, USC had, you don't end up getting that benefit of the doubt. And I don't know how much benefit of the doubt matters in a 12-team playoff, because I think you're still going to see arguments about resume and strength of schedule and all of those things and eye test, but it's not as consequential because there are more slots. You don't have to worry about how your record stacks up against somebody that's 12-0 when you're 10-2, because you're fighting against other 10-2 and 9-3 squads. So it's just apples to orange comparison. But the ACC, obviously, looking at this past season, has a perception problem, a credibility problem, where people don't view them on the same level as the Big Ten, SEC, and to a lesser extent the Big 12. They just didn't get that benefit of the doubt because the conference hadn't earned it. Because who's your juggernaut? Who's your number one? Who are you going to send into the octagon to face Georgia or Michigan or Alabama or Washington? If you're hanging your hat on Florida State with a quarterback that's got a broke leg, it's not a great number one. But if your number one can slide in at the 7 seed or the 8 seed, it's a big difference. And if you can have two schools that are 10-2 rather than one school that's 12-0, one school that's 11-1, 4 schools that are 10-2 or whatever, if you have one 10-2, it still allows you access to the playoff. Whether, frankly, you've earned it or not, it's still there. Like, that path to the playoff still exists for the ACC, that obviously at this point in time, at this moment in the college football history, the ACC needs that expanded lane to fight for a championship. And my number one slot is, I think it's without a doubt, the biggest beneficiary of an expanded college football playoff. It's Ole Miss. For a long time, Ole Miss was in a really crappy situation where I think divisions make sense, especially divisions based on geography, mattered and made a ton of sense and were super important in college football. And Ole Miss was in a really bad spot because in your division is Alabama, Auburn, LSU. The chances that you're going to beat all 3 of those in 1 year are pretty much slim to none. And it's the same, like in the Big Ten. Indiana was one of the toughest jobs in America during the Big Ten East-West days because your conference, like your division, is Ohio State, Michigan, Michigan State, Penn State. That's pretty much 4 losses guaranteed to start the season. So when your definition of success is based off of, like, we are going to go 0-4 in our biggest games because we're just not on the level. Now, they got to win here or there against Michigan State or Penn State or whatever. But for the most part, more years than not, you're showing up to that conference slate going 0-4. When you are an Ole Miss and you have LSU, Alabama, Auburn, A&M in your division, like, that's a tough spot to be in. Now, with a divisionless SEC and Lane Kiffin running an absolute juggernaut in the NIL world, in the transfer portal world, Ole Miss is going to get, and I've spoken a lot about benefit of the doubt, but you know what? A 9-3 Ole Miss is going to get more benefit of the doubt than a 10-2 insert ACC school here. 9-3 Ole Miss is going to get more benefit of the doubt than 10-2 Iowa State, because it's going to be the beneficiary of playing in the SEC and also having an explosive offense coached by Lane Kiffin. They're going to put points on the board. They're going to play an exciting brand of football, and they're going to do it maybe not necessarily beating the best teams in America, but not losing to bad teams either. Winning 10 games is hard. Ole Miss won 10 games this past season. For the first, I think, was it the first time ever? I think that's what the stat is. It's the first time ever Ole Miss won 10 games in a season. It's really difficult to do. And they did it in the SEC. And if they had made the college football playoff, I wouldn't have been surprised if Ole Miss won a game or two, depending on who they were matched up against. They're a huge beneficiary of a 12-team playoff because their path to winning a championship didn't go from, this back road, dirt road. It went to like a 9-lane one-way highway. Because all you need is a chance to get into the dance, right? Like, all you got to do is find a way into those 12 teams, and then whatever happens, happens. And Ole Miss is going to find itself either on the cusp or in that 12-team playoff way more often than not once it expands to 12 teams. And it makes the job more appealing. Because I think every time, like the second Nick Saban retired, there were like 3 names that people started listed off, and one of them was Lane Kiffin. And it makes sense that one of them would be Lane Kiffin, right? Like, Ole Miss is, in the grand scheme of things, at their best thus far in SEC history, is like a B plus tier program. More often than not, like a C tier program. But if being a B-tier program now gets you a chance to win the national championship, that makes that job much more attractive. The recruiting base is there. The fan base is there. It makes it a really appealing place to be rather than looking to climb the ladder to go somewhere else where you can win a title. That opportunity now rests in Oxford, Mississippi, which it didn't 2 years ago. And that's why I think the college football playoff expansion is a really good thing. I think it's a really good thing for the sport. But in certain locations, like at Ole Miss, it's a really big change. And we'll see how they handle it going forward. That'll do it for today's episode of the Daily Huddle. Should be the last audio-only version. This one's just because I'm traveling for work. My eye is getting better. At least it's like tolerable to look at. So we'll get back on the old video tomorrow on tomorrow's episode of the Daily Huddle. But I appreciate you making us a part of your day, however it is, wherever it is you're doing so. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. Make sure you're getting all the college football content we're pumping out here at Saturday Glory. If you're listening on a podcast feed, drop a 5-star review. It goes a really long way in helping out the channel. Be back at it tomorrow. Same bad time, same bad channel here on the Daily Huddle with Saturday Glory.